Hello, my name is Claude Butner, and I have the honor of being host today. Nandita Bajaj is the executive director of Population Balance, a U.S. nonprofit that works to inspire narrative, behavioral, and systems change that shrinks our human impact and elevates the rights and well-being of people, animals, and the planet. She also co-hosts the Overpopulation Podcast, a popular series that delves into the nuances of the drivers and impacts of human expansionism with expert guests. She is a senior lecturer at the Institute for Humane Education at Antioch University, where she teaches about the combined impacts of pronatalism and human expansionism on reproductive, ecological, and intergenerational justice. In addition to a number of peer-reviewed papers and forthcoming book chapters, her work has appeared in major news outlets. Human population has doubled in the last 50 years, growing from approximately 4 billion in 1970 to 8 billion currently. There is rising public awareness that overpopulation and rampant overconsumption are driving climate change, resource scarcity, and biodiversity collapse. Yet it is a challenging issue to discuss. In this talk, Nandita will discuss the pervasive influence of pronatalism and human supremacy as drivers of population growth, as well as reproductive and ecological injustice, and the implications of the silencing of this discourse on the most vulnerable, nature, people, and animals. And Nandita, take it away.
Thank you, Claude. And thank you for CACOR for hosting me today. And thank you to all the audience members who are here today. So I'll begin by describing the two terms that I'm using in the title of my talk. One is polycrisis. The term polycrisis has existed for a number of decades and was more recently popularized by the Cascade Institute. It refers to the interaction of crises across global systems and how they perpetuate one another. And that's where I'm borrowing the term from. And the crises, of course, include things like climate change, resource scarcity, biodiversity collapse, pollution, and many others. And the second term I'm using today is population denial. And denial, by definition, is declaring something to be untrue. And in this case, population denial means dismissing the impact of population on social and ecological crises, and not just declaring it to be untrue, but having really powerful institutions behind this denial, which is what I'll unpack today. So I'll begin with a really brief history about myself, just to give everyone an idea of where I'm coming from to this topic. I've had a fairly diverse and varied career over the last 20 years. Before actually I started my career, I was born and raised in India, which last year became the most populous country in the world. And regardless of what the nuances are between population and consumption among the rich and the poor and the Western and Eastern nations, for me, it was a visceral experience of living in a really densely populated country. And it's something that cannot be denied. The impact of a lot of people on nature, on human rights, and just on the ecological crisis. I moved here with my family to Toronto, Canada, 25 years ago, and I've lived here since. And over the course of those 25 years, I've changed my careers several times based on different revelations I've had over the course of my last few decades and how they've influenced my changing research interests. So I actually started out as an aerospace engineer in Canada. I worked for Bombardier Aerospace for a number of years. I later switched careers and became a high school teacher of physics and math for about a decade. And as I said, due to a number of personal experiences and concern over our cascading crises, I was moved to go back to school to do a master's degree about 5 years ago to study the connections between ecological overshoot, overpopulation, pronatalism, and human supremacy, and how they impact human rights, animal rights, and the rights of nature. As a result of that degree, I ended up becoming the executive director of Population Balance about 3 years ago. And around the same time, I also became a senior lecturer at Antioch University, the same place where I had graduated. And there I teach one of the first courses of its kind called Pronatalism, Overpopulation, and the Planet. I'll speak more about the work I do at Population Balance and my course later on in today's presentation. But I wanted to give you this history so you understand how I've evolved my thinking coming from overpopulation and having a visceral experience of that, experiencing pronatalist pressures through culture and family, waking up to the plight of other animals, and then trying to make connections in my own work. So that's what drives my research today. So today I will cover this outline. I'll start with a brief history of human expansionism, how our one species has come to dominate much of the planet at the expense of most other species and nature. Why, after gaining so much traction in the 1960s and 70s, population became such a taboo subject. And how do we confront population denial so that we can continue on the good work, some of the good work that was done to address population, and how to address the unmet need for reproductive autonomy and reproductive rights that hundreds of millions of women around the world suffer from. So population denial is an ideology that exists across the political spectrum, the left and the right, progressive and conservative. And here I'm going to start by sharing a few quotes from people I consider progressive, people who are worried about the plight of our planet. So I'll start with the Union of Concerned Scientists, who have a formal statement on their website that says, "We're sometimes asked, isn't population growth driving climate change? But that's the wrong question, and it can lead to dangerous answers." Katharine Hayhoe, who is the chief scientist at the Nature Conservancy. The Nature Conservancy, as a side, has been co-opted a lot by corporate interests recently, and we've done a podcast episode on that recently if people are interested. But regardless, Katharine Hayhoe is a very respected scientist. And on a recent interview for the CBC, she said, we reached 8 billion people in 2022, but that isn't causing climate change. It's not the number of people, it's how we live. And lastly, George Monbiot is a UK environmentalist and journalist, very popular. He writes for The Guardian, and he says people who claim that population growth is the big environmental issue are shifting the blame from the rich to the poor. So in all of those statements, there is an ounce of truth for why there is such a taboo. But the fact that population is being completely dismissed as an issue is a problem, because these statements are actually defying scientific fact. So I'm sure many of you are familiar with a history of population, but I'll just do a really quick overview here. This graph only goes as far back as 10,000 years in our past, but Homo sapiens have been around for between 250 to 300,000 years. And for most of our history, we lived as gatherer-hunter societies. It was about 10,000 years ago that we started engaging in the that agricultural revolution took place, when we started engaging in the domestication of animals and plants and created more settlement societies. I am jumping over quite a bit of history to get to the current time, but touching on things that are essential for today's presentation. A lot of anthropologists also believe that the surplus of food led to an increase in population rates during the next few thousand years. And patriarchy, with the rise of empires and states and the need to protect those states, emerged about 5,000 to 7,000 years ago. And patriarchy is defined as a lot of the different like hierarchical relations among, in terms of social relations. So gender, class, etc. And then about 200 years ago, around 1800, we had the Industrial Revolution, where due to access to cheap fossil fuel energy, we were able to turbocharge the small growth in population that we were seeing to grow from 1 billion, it took us about 300,000 years to get to the first billion. And in just 200 years, we jumped up to 8 billion. It's an anomaly in terms of any species behavior. And in taking over the rest of the planet through both our human population growth and consumption growth, we have wiped out much of nature and other species. Dr. Bill Rees is one of our wonderful colleagues and advisor. And also we interviewed him for our podcast recently. And here he describes in just a minute what this 200-year growth signifies.
I think it's really interesting to look historically at this whole question of growth, because for all intents and purposes, there was none for 250,000 years. In just the last 200 years, we've seen more change than in the previous entire history of human beings. Only 10 generations of human beings out of thousands have experienced this phenomenon of growth. Growth in population, growth in technology, in sufficient quantity so that they would notice in the course of their lifetimes. And so it's really a very, very recent phenomenon. But because all of us alive today and for the past few generations have been embedded within this growth dynamic, we take it to be the norm. And therefore, we project ourselves into the future as if it can continue forever. But the fact is that this is the single most abnormal period in human history. It's completely unprecedented, never occurred before, and can never occur again. I think it's really...
So, Dr. Rees is also someone who has done a lot of work on the concept of ecological overshoot over the last many decades. And ecological overshoot is a condition where we have overshot Earth's carrying capacity and are demanding more than Earth can sustain, both in terms of production and its waste absorption capacity. At this rate, we are consuming 75% more, or demanding 75% more than Earth can sustain or keep up with. And that's, of course, because of a rise in population by a factor of 8 and in consumption by a factor of 100 in the last 200 years. And of course, the consumption across the globe is very disproportionate. And this is where a lot of the confusion around population and consumption, but also tension around the two comes up, is so many of the rich countries have a really high per capita consumption compared to many of the poorer countries. And of course, the population in many of the countries here is swiftly rising, and as will the need to raise the level of consumption for these countries per individual. At the same time, you can see why it is an issue of injustice when you have so many rich countries consuming way beyond one planet living, what's sustainable for one planet living. And this is why this question often comes up around population discourse. Is it population or is it consumption? And as we saw in the population denial quotes at the beginning, a lot of people wish to dismiss the role of population by blaming our social and ecological crises entirely on consumption. But that is a false dichotomy. This does not mean that we dismiss the gross differences in consumption patterns across the world, but it does mean that while we are addressing the inequality in income as well as in consumption, we also have to remember that population is a multiplier of all things that are bad. Everyone who exists wishes to consume. Anyone who is poor does not choose to be poor and wishes to increase their standard of living and will do so as soon as the opportunity arises. Overpopulation is not an ideological myth. It is a scientific fact, as has been identified by some of the top scientific institutions. The UN, even though UN is increasingly becoming neoliberal and growth biased, yet the UN recognizes that population is a major factor in driving a lot of our crises. The IPCC recognizes population and economic growth as two of the key drivers that contributed to climate change over the last decade. The Royal Society, top eminent scientists have warned about population, and there are many scientist warnings that have issued warnings about the role of population, signed by tens of thousands of scientists around the world. The other issue that I was talking about with respect to increasing standard of living, this is where things get really more clear, is the global middle class. The global middle class is the fastest rising demographic today. 88% of the next billion people that will be joining the middle class, so people who live like Canadians and Americans, with rich lifestyles, with meat-heavy diets, with regular flights, car ownership, home ownership, and all of the things that has created such a huge consumption for us Westerners, is now being shared across the globe. 2/3 of the global middle class by the end of this decade could be represented by Asia's population. 350 million people is almost the same as the population of the States, 10 times the population of Canada. So you can imagine 20 more Canadas being added to the world in terms of consumption, or 2 more US. And of course, there's a third component there. So the question about whether it's population and consumption really cannot be separated in this way, because again, as soon as people have the means, they will increase their level of consumption. And from a social justice perspective, a certain level of increase in consumption is necessary for people. Whether people need to rise to the gross level that we have held up for the rest of the world is a different question. So why did it become so difficult to talk about population over the last few decades? I owe it to three different things, though there are many others that fall under these areas. The first one being the concept of human supremacy, past policies, and the third one being pronatalism, my specific area of research. So my colleague, Dr. Eileen Christ, describes human supremacy as a worldview that esteems the human as a distinguished entity that is superior to all other life forms and is entitled to use them and the places they live. I'm going to play another clip from Dr. Rees because he's a really amazing explainer. So here in the podcast, I asked him to explain what he thinks human exceptionalism is.
Sure. I think it's really important to emphasize something that you've alluded to here, and that is that human beings are storytellers. We don't live in reality the way other species do. We make up stories, and then we live out of those confections as if they were the real thing. And exceptionalism, the word you used, is one of those stories. So it's a philosophical concept, I suppose, with deep roots in religion, but it subscribes to the belief that human beings are outside of nature. We're not like other organisms. Many people don't like to think of themselves as animals, for example. And once you've developed a story that puts you outside of nature, then clearly you are, I suppose, liberated from the laws of nature, biophysics, physics, and so on and so forth. So here we are, a species that is unique in the world as far as we know, in that it considers itself to be not part of the system of which it is deeply a part. So the story deviates enormously from the reality. And I think that's a major source of many of our problems.
And some of the problems that he points to show up like this: humans in the extinction crisis. As our population has grown from 1 billion to 8 billion in just the last 200 years, you can see the extinction of species lockstep with the growth of our population. And the background rate is here, the rate at which species would normally go extinct without human interference. And currently this is the rate with our expansionism. And of course, as we are demanding more from nature, this graphic does a really striking job in depicting what we have done to the planet. So 96% of the terrestrial biomass currently of all mammals is represented by us and the animals that we kill for food. And only 4% of that is wild animals. 10,000 years ago, as far as we know, to the best estimates that we have available, that number used to be 99%, and we represented only 1% of the mammalian biomass. So that has completely flipped. We have, as some ecologists say, colonized the planet. I won't go as deeply into human supremacy apart from this, because I'd like to focus a bit more on pronatalism and past policies. So the next thing I'm discussing is past policies and how that contributed to population taboo. So when we became aware of population being a severe issue in the 40s, 50s, 60s, even around the time the UN was formed, there was an acute awareness after the Second World War that population growth was leading to a lot of social crises, poverty, conflict, resource scarcity, as emerging economies were unable to keep up with the growth in population. So a lot of different policies over the next few decades were put into place to help curb the population. Most of the policies were empowering, rights valuing methods that actually confronted harmful patriarchal norms and gave people, especially girls and women, the power to choose what happened to their bodies, when they had children, if they had children, how many children they had, by giving them access to both education as well as access to services, family planning services. However, there were also a number of policies that were coercive, top-down population control policies, such as China's one-child policy, such as the forced sterilization campaign in India and Puerto Rico. And interestingly, it was around, well, within that same century, we also had some remnants of post-eugenics policies playing out that particularly harmed the rights of the most marginalized communities. And so even though most of the policies that related directly to population reduction and family planning fell into this category, so much so that countries like Iran, Costa Rica, Indonesia, and a number of other countries Thailand, managed to get their fertility rate, the total fertility rate, down from over 6, average number of children that a woman would have, to under 2 in a matter of a decade or 2 decades. And all of that was done by enhancing reproductive rights, educational opportunities, and confronting patriarchal norms. But because of the legacy of some of the negative policies, a lot of people just became convinced that population discussion or discourse always leads to this coercion and top-down control. And over the next few decades, funding for family planning services dropped significantly, and population started to lose momentum, both in academia and in places like the UN and NGOs, because people just did not want to be associated with coercion or racism. It was actually directly as a result of some of these family planning policies that enhanced reproductive rights that fertility rates started to decline significantly. Because as one of our speakers earlier was saying, as soon as you remove barriers, patriarchal barriers from people's lives, whether it's religion, family, tradition, political pressures, ethnocentrism, and women are given the autonomy to decide if and when and how many children to have, they overwhelmingly choose to have fewer or no children. And that is the pattern that we saw incredibly over the next few decades directly as a result of those policies. And yet, even today, of the many hundreds of million women who are of reproductive age, there are at least over 200 million of them who have an unmet need for modern contraception. And here it doesn't just mean just having availability to contraceptives. Unmet need here means women wish to avoid a pregnancy, but it's either familial pressures, stigma around using contraceptives, the fear of abuse or violence towards them, or religious barriers where there is shame involved if a woman is seen using contraceptives. So availability is actually a really small part of this, the unmet need. It's actually a lot of psychological barriers. And so to this day, that many women and girls do not have access. The other thing I want to point out that even though the fertility rate over the last 50, 60, 70 years has been declining from about 5 to now 2.3, the population itself has not been declining. There's a lot of alarmism today. If you check any news outlet, they're talking about fertility decline and conflating that with population decline. 50 years ago, our population was 4 billion in 1970, and the growth rate was 2%. So we were growing at 80 million a year. Today, even though the growth rate is half of what it was, there are more people today. So 1% of 8 billion, we're actually still adding 80 million people each year today. So population is still growing. And according to most projections, whether you consider the more conservative UN projections or some of the others from other demographic studies, population is expected to continue to grow at least to the middle of the century, if not later, till the 2080s, according to the UN. The other interesting thing that is often missed in this population denial discourse is that efforts to increase birth rates for not just the last 30, 40, 50 years, but for millennia have been far stronger and more pervasive than efforts to lower birth rates. So a lot of people who are worried about violations of reproductive rights do not understand that reproductive rights have been under violation for thousands of years because of pronatalist pressures, which is what I'll talk about next. So pronatalism, I'm going to play another short clip with a journalist and a scientist that we interviewed, Angela Saini, who recently came out with a book called The Patriarchs: How Men Came to Rule. And she explains the institutionalization of pronatalism, the societal pressures placed on women to have children.
The idea of a gender division of labor is actually a relatively recent one. The big turning point comes with the emergence of the first states. That's at least where we can see it in the record very clearly. You can imagine in those very early states, what were the big concerns of the elites who were trying to form those states? Obviously, population must have been very high up that agenda, because if you're creating a society in which you need people to create a surplus for those at the top, in which you need people to be available to defend the state and die for it if necessary, then you need people. They are the number one valuable commodity right throughout history. So, of course, over these thousands of years, you see pressure fall on young women to have as many children as possible, which in hunter-gatherer societies, otherwise they do not do. And also pressure falls on young men to be available to defend the state.
And through the thousands of years of socialization and internalized patriarchal norms, both within society and within policies, pronatalism today it's so elusive that most people don't even know that it's there. It's like the water we're swimming in. And so the definition of pronatalism, here I'm using, there are many definitions, but this one is from author Laura Carroll that describes it as the idea that parenthood and raising children should be the central focus of every person's adult life. It is a strong social force and includes a collection of beliefs so embedded that they've come to be seen as true. Now, talking about pronatalism or confronting it doesn't actually mean challenging parenthood. What it means is to challenge the ideology that compels everyone to follow that path for other demographic goals. Other demographic goals include, you could just have cultural pressures to increase numbers, to have lots of children. Religion plays an absolutely enormous role in pushing people to have more children, for more followers. So there are sayings like be fruitful and multiply that occur and exist across all different religions. And the definition of marriage, for example, is the purpose of marriage is seen as to procreate. Why else would you do it? There's immense pressure from corporations to create more consumers so that we can buy more stuff. And of course, there's a lot of pressure, continues to be a lot of pressure from politicians and the elites to create more taxpayers, more cheap laborers, more military. It can be to fight a demographic war, to outnumber the competing tribe or ethnicity within the country. Whatever it is, pronatalism undermines reproductive autonomy, and it harms not just the rights of potential parents, but also the rights of children who are seen as commodities for all of these different growthist institutions. And pronatalism within family, which, family is not often looking through the lens of growth. Family is not trying to increase demographic numbers for other powerful institutions. But you can see over millennia of internalized pronatalism, there are so many misconceptions and myths and pressure from family that are placed on people to have kids. And some of it is ideas around, how will you know real love if you don't have your own children, or if you don't have so many children? Who's going to take care of you when you're older? Like having kids just in terms of having an insurance policy for old age, or carrying on a family legacy, leaving proof that you existed. And so, of course, we are, like all other species, hardwired to have the capacity to reproduce, but we're not hardwired to want to reproduce. Not everybody wants to have children or have a given number of children. So you can see pronatalism plays a huge part in dictating the fertility size of the different communities. And it's no surprise that depending on the community in which you live, you ask people, how many kids do you want? And often they'll say, whatever the norm within that community is. If the norm is 7, then if you don't want to get excommunicated or subjected to violence or divorced, you're going to say 6 or 7 is your desired family size. So social norms play a huge role, and a woman who is unable to have children or unwilling to have children, either any children or more children, can be physically abused, can be raped, divorced, economically marginalized, socially stigmatized, There are so many punishments in place for people, especially girls and women, that often abiding by societal rules is the safest thing for people to do. And so you can see how pronatalism is extremely harmful, both for parents and children alike, but also for men and all of what's related in terms of masculinity and virility and all of the myths around what it means to be a father that comes with pronatalism. So these are current day manifestations of pronatalism from top news outlets. Any news channel you open today, you're going to see the pathways that governments are taking to reverse the fertility decline that has occurred over the last 50 years. Because of all of the great efforts that were put into increasing gender equality, we started to see fertility decline. We see as soon as women have choice, they have fewer children that they can care for well. But because of growthist ideology, whether it's religion, economy, ethnocentrism, military, all of these governments are actually backsliding in terms of gender rights and reproductive rights, and are bringing back really traditional norms to push women to produce more babies. I've got some quotes from specific politicians that I will let you read. So the very idea that a woman must become a mother, so her identity is very much tied to motherhood. Pope Francis, the Vatican continues to have an extremely strong chokehold on contraceptive and abortion access, as in restrictions on the two. Even though Pope Francis is more progressive than several other popes, he does peddle population decline alarmism by calling people who are having no or fewer children selfish, which is an interesting concept if you really consider why people have children and why not having them is considered selfish. Another one here is religion and ethnocentric motivated. Viktor Orban in Hungary. And Matt Schlapp, chairman of the American Conservative Union, who played a major role in reversing the reproductive trajectory over the last few years within the US with the overturning of Roe v. Wade. If you say there's a population problem, but you're killing millions of your own people through legalized abortion, well, if we get rid of legal abortion, then we don't have a population problem. Then we can continue to make more of the Native American babies. And billionaires have a lot to benefit from population growth. Elon Musk has been the greatest propagandist over the last few years, where he is ringing these alarm bells saying population collapse is actually a much bigger civilizational risk than climate change. And that birth control and abortion that has led to gender equality and greater reproductive autonomy are actually getting in the way of continued population growth, and that suggesting that we should take those away, which is actually starting to happen in more and more countries. Jeff Bezos thinks that trillions of humans living in the solar system, not just on Earth, would be incredible. We could have thousands of Mozarts and Einsteins, and our solar system would be full of life and intelligence and energy. And of course, pun here on energy is billionaires, like a lot of these politicians, are energy blind, as in they do not understand the ecological limits, the biophysical limits of the planet, and they just really believe that we can engineer our way out of all of the problems through just having, billions of money poured into technological advancements, the kinds that they are both interested in. Now, interestingly, I'm going to see if any of you recognize the names of institutions here. All of these are American libertarian institutions that, if you are familiar with the work of Dr. Naomi Oreskes and Dr. Eric Conway, the book that they wrote, Merchants of Doubt, many of these appeared in that book. And of course, they appeared because they played a huge role in climate denial and tobacco smoke denial. Interestingly, why are they showing up again? Well, because they are playing a huge role, pouring billions of dollars into perpetuating population denial. You would have to ask yourself, why would a libertarian organization that is primarily interested in economic freedom and market fundamentalism and has no history of working in demography, in reproductive rights, in sociology, anthropology, social norms, none of that, why would these institutions have anything to say about overpopulation? Not only overpopulation, but the fact that it's a myth. So, of course, population is very strongly tied to economic growth. And there are many people, especially those at the top, who benefit from population growth because of so many offshoot reasons, like cheap labor, being able to extract more from other countries by really abusing their labor, etc. But we actually happened to interview Dr. Naomi Oreskes last year on her new book called The Big Myth, which is about how free market fundamentalism is undermining American democracy. But in this episode, she actually ends up talking about how they're the same organizations that fueled climate denialism are fueling population denialism.
Why would an organization like the Cato Institute or the Foundation for Economic Education say that overpopulation is a myth? Well, these are organizations whose central activities is to promote libertarian ideology in order to push back against government action in the marketplace. We do know that many of these organizations are heavily funded by Fortune 500 companies, captains of industries, who stand to benefit from weak government regulation. And so if we say population is a serious issue, in part because of the destruction of biodiversity, the destruction of habitat, pushing up against planetary limits, coerced reproduction of many women across the world, there's a whole set of issues here that invite a conversation about governance, about the role of governments, and also about governance through NGOs, local institutions, etc. And all of these things point to the need for planning, thinking about the future, and figuring out what are appropriate responses. They hate planning because they associate planning with socialism.
So that is a really interesting discovery that we've recognized just through Dr. Oreskes' work over the last few years is population denial is very much rampant across the political spectrum, but especially among my progressive colleagues who claim to care deeply about social and ecological justice. And yet, when we talk to them about population, they are worried that, talking about population can lead to accusations of racism, of coercion, of reproductive rights violations, etc. And you wonder, where are those messages coming from? Who is perpetuating those messages? And if you look at the billions of dollars being poured by these industries, by these organizations and think tanks, and you look at top media outlets where they are given ink space, Washington Post regularly allows folks from the American Enterprise Institute to write opinion editorials, despite knowing there being complete, transparent information available that they are funded by ExxonMobil and by the Koch brothers. So when you start to see organizations and outlets like the New York Times, Vox, Washington Post, and other major outlets who are allowing such discourse while not allowing other scientific discourse equal space, you really do start to understand why the progressives have so disproportionately believed in this propagandist message, when there is so much science that shows not only that population is a humongous issue, but also that most of the population policies in the past were actually rights-based and autonomy-enhancing. And by removing population from our sustainability discourse, we have really failed the most vulnerable people. I would put on top of that list is the girls who are pushed into child marriage because there aren't enough resources to provide for education, for family planning services, for changing social norms. The women who are forced into pregnancy over and over again, in places where they don't have a lot of autonomy, where there's a lot of patriarchal control, and increasingly in countries all around the world, including a lot of industrialized Western countries where reproductive rights are increasingly under threat because governments are worried about fertility declining too quickly. So to finish off, how do we confront population denial? Well, that's the full responsibility of my job that I do, and my colleagues who work with me, our small team. We are constantly working to confront population denial and bring it back into the discourse as a feminist issue, as a reproductive justice issue, as a social justice issue, and an ecological justice issue. And instead of giving you a point-by-point plan of how do we confront it, because that really is a really large mission that we've undertaken, I can show you some of the work that we do. So first, just want to point out that these are the UN projections for population for the rest of the century. According to the UN, our population, if we stay the course, if nothing changes, is expected to rise to about 10.5 billion by the end of the century. If we reduce the total fertility rate by only 0.5, so it's 2.3 right now, if it becomes 1.8, we see a difference of 3 or 4 billion. And if we allow the Elon Musks and the Orbans and the Matt Schlapps of the world to have their way and to take away reproductive rights, we can see the population go as far as 16 billion. Now, a caveat here is necessary that the UN is not very ecologically, I'd say, grounded. And so in a lot of their projections, they are not considering collapse scenarios resulting from resource scarcity, conflict, climate change, a devastating death toll from all sorts of ecological crises. and also different, so as a result, they're not, I think, taking into account the possibility of population declining through disaster much more quickly. However, even if you look at some of the other projections, you do see population continue to increase well into the middle of the century. Regardless, if we move away from just looking at people as numbers, which at population balance has never appealed to us, other than to recognize the impact that numbers do have on the rest of nature and the non-human beings. People are individuals with rights and aspirations for a good life. And if you look at them with dignity, and if you really think about what's needed for elevating reproductive rights and ecological rights, is to enhance both reproductive autonomy and support for family planning, and to counteract a lot of the growthism that is driving such pronatalism, we could see incredible decline in population over the next several decades. In terms of the different things that we do, we run a popular podcast of which you heard a few clips. We interview people on looking at human supremacy, ecological overshoot, patriarchy in India, in Uganda, looking at green growth fallacies, looking at, how do we embrace limits with grace rather than letting nature impose limits on us. We regularly engage in media advocacy. So we try to publish 10 to 20 pieces a year in major news outlets, trying to change the narrative, given that media is owned by so much of the corporate elite money. We try to get some space to get the narrative shifted. We also write for academic publications and journals to shift the narrative in academia, because believe it or not, a lot of academic institutions have also shied away from talking about demography and population in their sustainability courses. So we write papers to gain more credibility within the academic crowd. I teach a graduate course at Antioch University called Pronatalism, Overpopulation and the Planet, the Personal, Cultural, and Global Implications of Having a Child, where we look at the rights of children, the reproductive rights, the rights of nature, etc. Though the course is a graduate course available through Antioch for anyone wanting to take a credit course, at Population Balance, we've also started offering the course for people who just want to take it for general interest at a much more subsidized cost. So if you are interested in just spending 14 weeks with other people, diving more deeply into this subject over discussion-based Zoom calls, then that's a possibility for you. And lastly, we present at schools, universities, and conferences. The kind of presentation I did today, but can be tailored to any number of subjects. It can be, economic degrowth models. It can be the rights of non-human beings, etc. And with that, I'd like to thank you. And I'll point you to our tagline, which is shrink toward abundance. Abundance being the abundance of earth that is possible if we could shrink our human impact and the social relations that can become abundant if there are fewer of us, etc. So I will open it up to questions, but I'll first pass it back to Claude. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Nandita. And as the host, I have the prerogative of asking the first question. And Samrat is on base. I will invite Samrat to turn on his microphone and his video at this time. I'm of the generation that remembers when the book, The Population Bomb, came out. Of course, all the way through my early childhood and education, nuclear issues were foremost in people's minds as far as dread. And so the population bomb reminded us that no, mass starvation because of overpopulation is also very lethal. And is there a book today, Nandita, that takes the place of the population bomb in terms of being the one place where maybe people who are interested in this topic want to start?
I can recommend, well, my favorite book that I use in my course is about 10 years old, and it's called Countdown, Our Last Best Hope for a Future on Earth by journalist Alan Wiseman. That book does an incredible job in actually traveling through 22 different countries and looking at different social norms, as well as both around reproduction and family and religion, but also around ecological awareness and what people are doing for different species, for nature, etc. So that's a really good book. We love the work of Dr. Bill Rees. He hasn't recently written a book, but he's written a lot of great papers. I'm drawing a blank right now, but we interview so many people every 2 weeks for our podcast, and I see my co-host Alan Ware is here, and also my colleague Kirsten Stade, who writes a lot of our media pieces with me, is also here. So shout out to both my colleagues. But if any of you have ideas for books, Alan or Kirsten, please feel free to chime in. But I don't know if anyone does as great a job on the core subject of population as Paul Ehrlich did.
Thank you very much. Okay, let's see who's on deck here. Peter McKinnon has a follow-up question to a comment, and he is on deck. So you could turn on your camera and mic now, Peter, and I'd pass it over to Samrat.
Hi, Nandita. Really nice presentation. We'll obviously watch it again with more detail. My question is that how have people in India reacted to what all population balance and your institutions are doing?
It depends on which crowd I talk to. So the people who've invited me into their classes tend to be progressive university professors who are looking at gender and feminist studies. They love the work because it is, I mean, we both come from India, so we know how strict the gender norms there continue to be, and the expectation that people will get married, will have kids, etc. So a lot of younger people are really excited by the presentation because it just shows them a different pathway to follow. I also present every year at the International Conference on Sustainability Education, which is attended by 500 to 1,000 people, and they talk very openly about population, and the message there is also received quite well because they are population aware. But I know under the current government, population has become a bit of a flashpoint because of the religious components, the religious differences there.
Okay, thanks so much. Yeah.
Okay, Richard Vanderjacht is on deck, and right now we're going to hear the question from Peter McKinnon.
Thank you, Claude, and excellent presentation. I really quite enjoyed what you had to say, and I agreed with what you had to say as well. But I have a question, and my question is, what are your views on the impact of the late Swedish population researcher Hans Rosling, and has it played any role in any of the work you or your colleagues do?
So it's a two-pronged answer. So I think Hans Rosling, with his work on Gapminder, did a lot of great work on making data freely available and easily accessible to everyone. And I think his data itself was quite robust. And I hold him in good regard, for all the work he did. However, the second part of my answer is that he also, I think, inadvertently ended up peddling population denial, partly because of not having, I think, enough information about how demographics work. There was this idea that if people just become wealthier, if you raise the standard of people, they tend to have fewer kids, also known as the demographic transition theory. That has, for the most part, been debunked because more and more research has shown that people choose to have fewer children, not because they have greater wealth, but because they have greater choice. And whether you are poor or rich, access to reproductive autonomy in the form of counseling services, family planning, and contraceptive availability is the main reason fertility rates decline, not because economic growth. In fact, I think that narrative has really just fed into a lot of the neoliberal interests.
Well, thank you very much. And I might just mention, I have a connection with India in a couple of contexts. One is that when the population was less than 500 million, I backpacked in India with my wife on our honeymoon, several months, and we had a wonderful experience there from all levels of society. And the second is I was involved in helping bring the internet to India through the Telecommunications Authority.
Well, congratulations, that's incredible.
Thank you for your answers.
Of course, and of course, India would have been very pleasant to visit with that population because it is a gorgeous country, and it has made me very sad kind of watching it just, disappear in terms of its own beauty.
Well, it was a magnificent experience, and I say across all sectors of society. So we were very fortunate.
Amazing.
Okay, Dave Doherty is on deck, and now we'll hear the question from Richard Benderjack.
Okay, thank you. A great presentation. I enjoyed it thoroughly. I guess one of the things that this, I guess, to the hub, and you kind of addressed it, but how do you best address educating, particularly the young? I think that's where things start. Is especially when schools are banning sex education. How do you get around that? And what are your thoughts?
Yeah, so we don't work particularly with school districts on sex education curriculum, and we are totally disheartened to see where things are going with that. We're working kind of on the top, like we're trying to get into schools where teachers who are progressive and are thinking about ecological and social issues invite us into their classrooms. So right now we're actually not engaging, or ever, I don't think we have any plans of engaging in policy work. We're primarily an awareness raising organization that's trying to inspire shifts in narratives and behaviors, which can ideally allow the leaders, professors and teachers and nurses and doctors who invite us to do presentations to then have a multiplier effect with that message into their workplaces. So that's the extent of the work we're doing.
There's a great book, 3 Cups of Tea, which might be worth reading if you haven't read it already.
I haven't. I'll write it down. And I see that Ellen has put a couple of excellent recommendations for books. Thank you, Alan. Life on the Brink, Environmentalists Confront Overpopulation is an excellent anthology, co-edited by our board member, Dr. Eileen Christ. Her own book called An Abundant Earth Toward an Ecological Civilization is a great book. And Chris Tucker, another colleague, A Planet of 3 Billion, also a great book. In fact, if you go through our podcast list, and if you don't want to listen to the episodes, but you just want to look at the books or papers these authors have written, it's a great place to go. We mainly interview scientists and researchers.
Perfect.
Okay, I was going to put Alan on deck, but now you've actually covered that. I'll invite Alan, if you turn on your video and your mic, then you can be on deck. Otherwise, after David, let's see, I think we're running out of questions here. Carpenter is on deck. You can turn on your video and mic at this time. Go ahead, Dave.
Thank you, Claude. I never thought about the question this particular way, and I'm very interested in your answer. Are we facing a two-pronged dilemma, controlled growth or collapse, or is the future more complex than that?
Can you elaborate, please?
So at the moment, we're, for all intents and purposes, in uncontrolled growth.
Yes.
A lot of people are advocating, and they put different labels on it, like green growth or sustainable growth. That's one I read yesterday, which, I mean, I don't think that those adjectives are appropriate in the first place. It's still growth. But we could look at it as controlled growth, if we can find ways of powering our civilization, being more inventive about how we deal with pollution and recycling, etc. If we don't, the dilemma appears to be, well, it's either we learn to control growth or we're going to collapse in our own wastes and for lack of resources. But I'm wondering if you think that the future is actually more complex than that.
Well, definitely, I think it is more complex than that, partly because the thing that I mentioned, earlier about the disproportionate distribution of wealth and resource use and consumption. So there's, a lot of degrowthers. We do align with a lot of degrowth literature. We see ourselves as advocating for a future that's moving toward degrowth, is just not holding up growth as a necessity for prosperity or well-being. And we've interviewed a lot of ecological economists on that. But you'll see that even, a lot of degrowthers will say that a certain degree of growth is necessary for, countries that really have very poor standards of living. So maybe in that case, the growth needs to be super controlled, because at this rate, most countries are aspiring toward a North American standard of living, because that has become the idealized, notion of well-being. And we know that this is a gross level of consumption that we're engaging in. Even the ones who are very minimalist, we just can't help but have really high resource use, just by virtue of being in a high energy country. So I think your question, and probably the answer of, with those countries, can we allow, obviously, local initiatives and traditional initiatives that have worked so well before the growth economy kind of took over and capitulated a lot of traditional ways of having social relations, to maybe bring those back, and whatever growth is necessary, and I'm not an expert in that area, but to have a very controlled level of growth there, and have significant reduction in production and consumption in the wealthy countries. but I'm not sure if that is going to happen at the rate at which we're going. So I think the collapse scenarios that you brought up are just as equally likely and already happening.
Thank you for that answer. I just wanted to make one observation related to something that was early on in your talk, and that was Monbiot saying that we were putting the blame on the poor. And I do exactly the opposite. If you look at a guy like Musk, he's got something on the order of, I don't know, 11 kids or something like that.
Yeah.
No, this is not a problem of the poor.
Yeah.
This
Yes.
is a problem of attitude.
Yes.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. And I completely agree with you. I mean, that's why we don't talk about population in one country and consumption in other. I mean, the US is the most, if you were to look at consumption and population, it's the most populous country in the world in terms of ecological overshoot.
Okay, Rick Carpenter is on deck and Charlie Hall has the floor. You are muted, Charlie.
Well, I'm on now.
Yes.
Nandita, I thought that was a wonderful talk, and congratulations for facing what other people don't face, and I don't understand why. Well, I do partially, and so my question for you, and it relates perhaps to our next Paul Ehrlich, whoever that is. A lot of the pressure for population growth comes from the competitiveness of nations. You know, I would guess Ukraine and Russia both would like to have more soldiers, unfortunately, and all kinds of messes in the Mideast, and whoever knows what else is cooking that we know less about. I don't have any particular solutions to talking about pronatalism for military means or power projection means or whatever it might be, but this concept certainly seems to go throughout human history in much of the world. And I'm not expecting you to have an answer for me in your back pocket, but maybe you do. And but I think somehow we have to do a better job of addressing it. And I'm an ecologist. In ecology, we talk about maximum power, and I'll try to send you a paper on that. And that's a little bit disturbing to me because it does seem to be a general pattern in nature, and we're part of nature. And much of what the world requires now is for us to be the opposite of what our genes have designed us to be, which is basically, pardon me, but horny and acquisitive. That's worked well in our evolutionary past, and now we have to sort of work against human nature. And, you know, you've got as many good ideas as anybody, and bless you for that. But I am worried at this time, as the world seems to be increasingly militarized, that that takes precedence over what I see as a disastrous situation coming in the next generation. And with respect particularly to our most important energy resources.
Yeah.
You can say anything you want to that, including nothing, including get lost.
No. Well, that's a very well thought out point, and I don't think I'm able to address all of it or equipped to address it. But the one thing I can say, you know, in terms of human nature arguments, is we have existed for, you know, 250,000 years.
On a constant energy budget.
Right. right.
And now with the fossil fuels, we've increased it by several orders of magnitude.
That's true. Yes. Yes. But interestingly, over the last couple of 100 years, and then thousands of years of what I talked about, institutionalized patriarchy, I think the thing about human nature that you were saying, that we're wired to want to have sex and to have lots of children, I think the first may be true, though not for
I don't,
everyone.
yeah, the first is true. The second is just, there's a consequence, I think.
And I think institutionalization of it, it's not just a consequence, it's a control. It's a reproductive control through these patriarchal norms that, you know, if you look at, I mean, we've interviewed a couple of other journalists. Angela Saini's is a good one to listen to, where she talks about how, you know, in hunter-gatherer societies, women were not having the number of children they're being forced to have now. They were much more spaced out. It was not sustainable for them to have that many kids. And even though a lot of people think that birth control really only became available, you know, in the last 50, 60 years, there was hundreds of years of anthropological proof that exists. Another interview we did with Bob Engelman that you would find interesting is he talks about how there were midwives and women who were using herbal remedies to control births and to induce abortions, or to, you know, kind of like the morning after pill. But they had figured out over millennia these herbal remedies to control reproduction, and they did, until such time that they couldn't, because of, you know, greater reproductive control. So I think our best chance is really getting young people, getting them, you know, more active and activated by this type of messaging. And we're seeing women voting with their feet. In terms of fertility declining, no matter what governments are doing.
Look at what's going on in the United States, and in their conservative governments, in, you know, in India and in Hungary and other places that are beating the pro-natalist drums, often
Exactly.
for quasi-military. I mean, maybe the best solution is to turn the whole ruling of the world over to women. I'd vote for that, but I don't think we're going to get very far.
And yeah, I mean, the thing that you're saying, you know, about what's happening with all these countries and taking away rights is really a backlash, right, to greater gender equality, leading to population decline in a lot of industrialized countries. And of course, population decline is tied to, as you've said, a decline in ethnocentric tribes, decline in nation strength, economic power, etc. So that comes as a threat to the powerful institutions that rely on population growth. But the thing we've been noticing is no amount of pronatalist policies. Countries have been throwing billions of dollars trying to convince women to have more kids for the economy or for the state. They're not doing it because they're having babies for themselves, not for the state. And people, individuals and couples know what's best for them. And I continue to hope that, you know, women will continue to stay empowered and not respond. Of course, our fear is when bribery doesn't work, coercion replaces it. So that's our fear, is coercive, you know, abortion bans and taking away contraceptive access, birth control pills.
We're doing it in the US.
We totally are. Yes. So crazy. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. And Rick is next, but John Legg is on deck. So John, turn on your camera and your mic, please. And go ahead, Rick. You are muted, Rick.
Thank you, Claude. Nandita, this is a wonderful presentation, and I'm so glad that I'm here to participate in it. There was an earlier question about education, Richard's question, and I understood your answer to being that it's a bit sensitive to be discussed in the classroom, and therefore schools tend to avoid putting this on the curriculum. But I wonder if you've given thought to social media, which we know is very much used by the young. I mean, if we agree that the message that you are propagating should reach the young, and particularly the young, social media, to me, I'm not very familiar with it, but I hear a lot about it, seems to me to be the medium. I was interested in the journals that you presented in the slide, and they're ones that I love reading, but I don't think people younger than, I don't know, 30 take the time to do that.
Yes, yes, you're absolutely correct. And you'll see that, you know, we have this kind of multi-pronged approach. We're trying to reach media to change the narrative there, because different people on the left and the right are reading these articles, and they need to know that other opinions and facts exist other than the growth ideology that we're being seen, you know, perpetuated constantly. The academic presentations that we're doing are definitely reaching young people because it's university and high schools, but it's, you know, the teachers invite us, and it's not that many that we can reach compared to, say, social media that can, you know, be watched millions of times. So we're very excited to share that we actually are launching a social media initiative in a couple of weeks. We've just recruited a video content producer, so a woman who's actually creating short, 1-minute, pithy and clever and just, you know, kind of attractive videos that would attract attention to the subject that we're going to start releasing in about a month. And our goal really with that was to target the young people. So it's happening. It's a great idea. And we're doing it. We hope it reaches a lot of people.
I wish you luck. That's wonderful.
Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you so much. And John Legg is next. And I think our last questioner will be, did Peter, did you have a follow-up question? If you did, you can turn on your camera. Otherwise, John Legg will be our last questioner. Okay.
Thank you, Claude. And Professor Bajaj or Nandita, I congratulate you for such a searching and deep presentation.
Thank you.
My question has to do with the number of organizations which appear to be out there in terms of their useful life on a global basis to slow the deterioration of our planet. But when I look for some focus or some area that could appear hopeful, frankly, it appears to me hopeless in the number of them and the dilution of them. Now, this is a bit of a personal thing, so please ignore that. But my final question is this simply my attitude of hopelessness, or is the situation more correctable? And I mention these all excellent groups, and that's without even going outside that. That is to say, the major distractions in the world, such as Ukraine and the Middle East.
Yes. Yes, great observation. in terms of the different organizations that exist, and especially what you mentioned, the dilution, because that's something that we've been really disheartened by, is a lot of organizations that one would think are conservation organizations, like the Nature Conservancy, like the NRDC, World Wildlife Fund, Sierra Club. We recently interviewed Professor Clive Spash on our podcast, and he's come up with a book called Social Ecological Economics, and it's a move to radically degrow for social and ecological justice. And in a lot of his research, he actually showed that there has been industry capture, corporate capture of these conservation organizations, because they were starting to pose a threat to the powerful institutions. So that was really sad for us to hear, because all these organizations we think are working for nature, that should be our allies, are now being run by these top 1% financiers. So to answer your next question, we can probably relate to a lot of your hopelessness that you are feeling. We don't have any grand illusions of moving towards some kind of a utopian future with the work that we are doing. I think we are very honest in terms of the collapse that is unraveling and has already started to unravel in many places in the world. And I think the position we've taken as an organization is to try to minimize as much suffering as possible, and by trying to change as many individual lives as possible, by empowering people to do the right thing, whether that means, adopting children, whether that means redefining what family means, choosing smaller number of children, but really looking at the impact of our procreative choices, our consumption choices on other people, but also us, giving up a lot of this stuff that's been held up for us as like the ideal, message of prosperity. It's not prosperity to live with such indulgent values. We find, our team, the less we have, the more we give up of this material world, the more liberated and joyful we feel. And we want to encourage people, as our tagline says, to shrink toward abundance, to really think about shrinking in an abundant way, personally and for life on Earth. So I hope that helps.
Yes, it does. And I, very fast, a bit unfair follow-up. Do you think the UN has any role whatsoever in this, in focusing attention? I have a feeling it would be leaving out so much that the UN should be involved in, that in fact it would not be a useful endeavor.
Yes, we actually have a paper coming out in a few weeks where it's a really strong critique of the UN's continued commitment to growth. Dave mentioned earlier, sustainable growth, and words like the two words that don't go together. The UN is still very committed to its oxymoron phrase of sustainable development. It's very much influenced, as far as we see, by industry and the interests of industry. And growth is very much tied to a lot of their policies and messages, and they don't seem to be ecologically aware. The rights of nature simply, is not a discourse that's happening there. Nature is still kind of seen as a resource for us. But even then, even from a human-centric perspective, I think it's really far off in its understanding. Obviously not, I cannot say that about the entire institution because it's so huge, but the messages we are seeing coming, I'm sure there's disagreements and conflicts within the UN, but the messages we are seeing are very pro-growth, and it's disheartening.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for that comment. And our last questioner, Peter, can you make it brief? We're actually over time.
Yes, I'll just read my question. Thank you very much, Nandita. My question is, has the Hole in the Wall initiative by a local school teacher in New Delhi had an educational impact with respect to your efforts about education and population, particularly in India, but elsewhere, because this whole hole in the wall thing is spreading?
I haven't heard of it, and I'm eager to learn more about it. I'm going to look it up.
Yes, please do. In fact, check out TED Talks for a good start.
Okay.
So
that
just
would be
search
a
Hole in
great
the Wall,
start.
and you'll get TED Talks. It's an excellent, absolutely phenomenal initiative by a teacher to help kids learn, and get kids teaching themselves.
Amazing. I will look it up, and I'll see if they want to partner with us in any way.
Good.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for your presentation.
And before I turn,
and for the many questions and answers, comments. Thank you.
Great.
Thank you so much. And before I turn this over to Jean for our official thanks, I want to read Paul Beckwith's note here. Excellent talk and great questions. Thanks, Nandita and CACOR. Now, Jean, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. And thank you, Claude. And Nandita, thank you so much for a fabulous presentation. It's great to hear a balanced presentation about the real elephant in the room that is certainly a problem that we need to face and talk about. So this has been great. And I'm very grateful that you were able to come and give this wonderful presentation to CACOR. As the past president for CACOR, it is my privilege to be able to give this thanks on the for the organization, to say thank you for coming and giving this presentation to us. And I hope that people will come back and look at this particular presentation again, because it has a wealth of information in it. You will be able to see this presentation if you go to our website, canadiancore.com, and look at the Stay Informed section and actually register for that. And you'll be able to see this presentation and other presentations that we've had in the past. You will have a chance to go and look at any of them and review this recording when it comes back on the internet later on today. Probably. For those of you who are interested in finding out more about our organization, we are in our 50th year, which is unusual for a not-for-profit organization that was looking at things associated with limits to growth, which started the whole thing with the Club of Rome. We are 50 years old in Canada, and we are still trying. If you're interested in finding out more about us as an organization, please go to canadiancore.com. And you can find out information about how to join us, how to become a member. And if you're interested in continuing on with some of the things that we are doing and just donating to us, you're able to do that too on our website. So thank you everybody for coming today. And I look forward to seeing more of these wonderful presentations. Thank you.